The vault had been sealed for 3 years. Every person in Wiltshire knew it, though none spoke of it directly. They knew the way one knows of a grief too large for polite conversation, a wound that had reordered the great house at Ashwell Park as thoroughly as any fire might have done. The solicitors knew it. The steward knew it. The county families who still left calling cards at the door knew it, though they knew better than to press for an audience with the Duke of Ashwell in the months after Lady Edwina's death. And Mrs. Patience Hollowell knew it best of all, because she was the one who had locked it. She stood now in the east corridor of Ashwell Park, in the early hours of a gray October morning, holding a brass key on a worn ribbon that she had worn around her neck for the entirety of her 3 years and 4 months of tenure as the late Duchess's lady companion. The key was cold against her collarbone. It had always been cold, even in summer. Even through the warmest week of July, when the house had been so quiet she could hear the clock in the upper landing from 2 rooms away. She had come to think of its weight as ordinary, in the way that grief's particular accessories eventually become ordinary. The locked drawer one no longer tries to open. The name one no longer says aloud in company. Around her neck. 3 years and 4 months. She had not once removed it to sleep. She was 24 years old, and she had been trying for the better part of a week to find a moment to return it. This was not so simple a matter as it sounded. The Duke of Ashwell was not a man who made himself easy to approach. He was tall and dark-haired and broad through the shoulder, with a stillness about him that had nothing of ease in it, the sort of stillness that precedes not rest, but severity. And since his wife's death, he had reduced his household interactions to the barest functional minimum. He spoke to his steward, a careful man named Broughton, who had served the family for 20 years. He spoke to his solicitor, Mr. Crane, who had arrived yesterday from London on some matter connected to the estate's trust. He did not speak to Patience Hollowell, who had lived at Ashwell Park for 3 years as his wife's companion, who had read to Edwina in her final months, who had held Edwina's hand as the fever took her, and who had then, on the morning after the funeral, been summoned to the study by the Duke himself and told, in 4 words, that she might stay. She did not know why he had said it. She had not asked. What she knew was that the vault beneath the house contained Lady Edwina's private correspondence, her personal effects, her journals, and the particular documents connected to her family's estate in Norfolk that had never been properly transferred to Ashwell's solicitors because Edwina had asked Patience to lock them away herself on the day the fever grew serious, and to keep the key until she was asked for it by someone with the right to ask. Mr. Crane, it turned out, had the right to ask. He had found Patience yesterday afternoon in the library, where she had been quietly cataloguing the late Duchess's books, a task she had undertaken in the autumn of her 2nd year at Ashwell Park. Partly because the library was in considerable disorder, and partly because working occupied the particular silence of large, grieving houses in ways that thinking alone could not. He had found her with a volume of botanical illustrations open on the reading table, and had told her, with the particular courtesy of a man who knows he is delivering an uncomfortable message, that the trust could not be settled without access to certain documents, and that the Duke required them, and that he understood she held the only key. Patience had set down the book carefully. She had looked at Mr. Crane, who was a small man with a neat gray beard and patient eyes, and she had said nothing for a moment. Then she had said yes, she did. She had spent last evening composing herself, and this morning she had risen before the household and come to the east corridor with the intention of completing a simple errand. Return the key, or if he preferred, accompany him to the vault and open it in his presence. Whatever was required. She was a practical woman. She had learned to be in the sequential schools of necessity that her life had provided. What she had not planned for was finding the Duke of Ashwell already standing in the east corridor when she arrived. He stood at the far end, near the door that led down to the lower passage, with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, looking at nothing in particular. He was dressed for the day already. Dark coat, no cravat yet, his dark hair not entirely settled. In the gray morning light from the corridor window, he looked like a man who had not slept well, which was, she suspected, nothing new. She had the distinct impression she was seeing something she had not been meant to see, and for a half moment she considered retreating to the stairs and returning in an hour. She did not. She was not given to retreating. She stepped forward. He turned. For a moment neither of them spoke. His eyes were the color of water over gray stone, and they moved from her face to the ribbon at her throat, with a precision that was not quite a question. "Miss Hallowell," he said. His voice was low and level, and carried, as it always did, the particular quality of a man who does not raise it because he has never needed to. "Your Grace." She brought her hand to the ribbon and lifted the key from beneath her collar. The ribbon was faded, she noticed, in the way that things are faded by proximity to a living body over years. "I was coming to return this." He looked at it for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. The key lay in her palm, small and cold and brass, and 3 years' weight of another person's trust. "Mr. Crane spoke with you?" "Yesterday afternoon, yes." "I intended to speak with you myself this morning." She had not expected that. She kept her expression composed, which she had learned to do in difficult rooms. In rooms where her composure was the only thing she could offer, that the room could not take from her. "I did not wish to trouble you any further than necessary." The matter seemed straightforward. Something moved across his face that she could not quite name. It was not displeasure, and it was not the brusque efficiency she had come to associate with his dealings with household matters. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has just been shown a thing he was not prepared to examine. "Come then," he said, and turned toward the lower passage door. The vault was accessible by a narrow stair that ran beneath the east wing, stone-floored and cold regardless of the season, lit poorly even when a lamp was carried. Patience had been down these stairs twice before. Once with Edwina, the week before the fever turned serious, when the Duchess had gathered the last of her private papers with a composure that had broken Patience's heart to witness, and once alone, on the morning after the funeral, when she had done what Edwina had asked. She had not been below since. The Duke carried a lamp. She carried the key. At the vault door, which was set into the stone of the lower passage wall and was unremarkable from the outside, nothing theatrical about it, just iron and old oak, and she stepped forward without being asked and fitted the key to the lock. It turned with the particular solidity of a mechanism that has not been disturbed in 3 years, not stiff exactly, but deliberate, requiring the full rotation. The door swung inward. The room smelled of cedar and old paper and something faintly floral that she recognized immediately, though she had not been prepared for it. Edwina had kept pressed violets in the drawer of her writing box, a habit she had maintained from girlhood, and the scent had permeated the small things of her private life. Patience had not anticipated it would still be here, preserved by the closed air and the cedar. She did not move for a moment. "Miss Hallowell." His voice was quiet. She realized her hand was still on the door, and she was not breathing quite normally, and her throat was doing something she had intended it not to do. She managed it. "Forgive me," she said. She stepped back and let him enter first. If she had imagined him many things in the 3 years she had lived in his house, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that a woman who has spent 3 years in the same household as a man inevitably forms some picture of his interior life. She had not imagined him standing in his dead wife's vault, looking as though the air had been drawn out of him. He stood very still in the center of the room, with the lamp held at his side, and the light caught the angle of his jaw and the particular set of his shoulders, which was not the composed severity she had come to associate with him in public rooms, but something older and quieter. A weight that had been carried for a long time by someone who had refused to set it down, because setting it down would have required looking at it. She pretended to study the shelves. There were 3 of them along the left wall, neatly ordered. Boxes, bound packets of correspondence tied with blue ribbon, 2 leather portfolios and 1 in green, a small brass-cornered writing case she recognized as the one Edwina had used for her personal accounts. She was a woman who had learned not to intrude on what she was not invited into, and so she looked at the shelves and gave him the room. She asked you to keep it. It was not a question. She answered it anyway. Yes. She said I would know when the right person asked. 3 years, he said. Yes. Another silence. She heard him move, the sound of the lamp being set on the table at the center of the room, the quiet shift of his coat as he stood still again. Then he said, "Why did she trust you with it?" Patience considered that for a moment. It was the first time in 3 years that he had asked her something that had nothing to do with the household, nothing to do with a meal or a schedule or the location of a particular document that Broughton had mislaid. "I think," she said carefully, "because I had no reason to use it wrongly." That is not the same as a reason to trust. No? She looked at him then, because not looking would have been its own kind of evasion. But it was enough for her. He regarded her steadily. She had stood in rooms with men of rank before, men who looked through women of her station as though they were furniture with the particular advantage of being capable of conversation on required subjects. She knew what that felt like, the glass-eyed attendance, the gaze that rested on her face without arriving. This was not that. This was a man actually looking at her, which was not the same experience, and had the further inconvenience of being difficult to maintain without feeling exposed. "The documents Mr. Crane requires," he said at last, "are in the green portfolio on the second shelf." She found it without difficulty. The vault was ordered, as Edwina had always been ordered. Even in grief, even in the particular organization of a dying woman who had not been certain how much time remained, the shelves were alphabetical and the ribbons tied to matching colors, and the portfolios labeled in a hand that was only slightly less steady than usual. As she lifted the green portfolio from the shelf, a small folded paper slipped from between its boards and fell to the floor between them. She picked it up before he could move, and then she saw what it was. The paper was folded in thirds and sealed with a small red seal that had been broken long ago and pressed shut again, and it was addressed, in Edwina's hand, in ink long since faded to the color of old tea. "For James, when he is ready to open the vault." She held it for a moment without speaking. The dust from the shelf was on her fingers. The vault smelled of cedar and violets, and 3 years of sealed air. She was holding a letter written by a woman who had known she was dying to the husband she was leaving behind, and she was standing in the same room as that husband who had not been ready to open the vault until a solicitor's errand had made it unavoidable. Then she turned and held it out to him. He looked at it in her hand for a long time. She did not rush him. She simply held it and let the moment be what it was, which was large and quiet, and not her moment at all. Then he took it and said nothing, and she could see from the set of his jaw and the particular way his hand closed around the paper that he would not open it while she was in the room, and she understood that she was meant to go. she went. What she would not know until later was that the letter contained 4 sentences. She would not know this for 6 weeks, which was the length of time it took for what happened next to complete itself. And yet the letter existed, and he read it alone in the vault with the lamp and the cedar smell. And whatever it said altered the particular gravity of Ashwell Park in ways that Patience, replacing the key to the now empty vault on the hook beside the steward's door later that morning, did not yet have the information to understand. If Patience had a wound that she carried, it was the wound of being told, repeatedly and in many different ways, that she was temporary. She had been told this first by her father's death, which had reduced the family's circumstances precisely enough that her 2 younger sisters required her income, and her own future had been postponed indefinitely. She had been told it again when she had come to Ashwell Park, because a companion's position was by nature impermanent, dependent on the continued existence and goodwill of the person she accompanied. Edwina's goodwill had never been in question. Edwina's continued existence had been the difficulty. She had come to understand herself as a woman of usefulness rather than a woman of consequence, which were not the same thing. And the understanding had settled over her like a second skin. She was careful. She was competent. She was, she supposed, invisible in the particular way that useful women are invisible in houses that contain more decorative alternatives. She did not resent this. She had other ways of spending her interior resources. Lady Cecily Bramhurst was decorative. Lady Cecily was 20 and golden-haired, and the daughter of the Earl of Fernmore, and she had been brought to Ashwell Park by her mother, the Countess of Fernmore, in the particular way of visiting that is not quite an invitation and not quite an intrusion, but is very clearly intended as a solution to a perceived problem. The Countess had arrived with a great deal of luggage and a manner of walking into rooms as though she had previously owned them. She was small and sharp-eyed and spoke to Patience with the polite inattention of a woman who has classified and dismissed another person inside the first 30 seconds of meeting her. "The companion," she said to her daughter, when they thought Patience had already left the morning room, having set down a tray and apparently departed. "Edwina's creature. I wondered what they'd done with her." Lady Cecily made a small sound that was either sympathy or indifference, and Patience, who had not in fact left, but had been in the window recess returning a volume to the shelf, set down the book she was holding and walked quietly from the room. She closed the door behind her without sound. She had heard that word applied to her before, in different houses. Edwina's creature. Someone's creature. It had the sting of a label designed not to wound but simply to classify, which was somehow worse. She did not mention it to anyone. She mentioned very little, as a general practice. This was one of the disciplines her years of service had given her, and she wore it as she wore the rest of her discipline, which was without display. What she noticed, because she was observant in the way that invisible women often are, was that the Duke of Ashwell did not appear to find Lady Cecily's presence a solution to anything. He was civil. He was unfailingly civil, which was one of the disciplines his rank and his temperament had given him in equal measure. But there was something in the quality of his civility toward the Countess and her daughter that was different from the quality of his civility toward, for example, his steward or his solicitor. It was the civility of a man performing a function, rather than of a man in the presence of something he wished to be near. It was careful and regular, and cost him something. She could see that it cost him something, and it reminded her of the civility she herself deployed in rooms where she was not comfortable. She noticed this, and she did not examine it, because examining it would have required a set of assumptions she was not entitled to make about a man who was a duke and a widower, and her employer, all 3 of which categories constituted excellent reasons not to permit herself any particular line of interior inquiry. What she did not notice, because it happened behind her, was that when she left a room, he frequently looked at the door she had left through for several seconds longer than the situation required. The Countess noticed, however. She was a woman who had been watching people in rooms for 30 years, and she had excellent peripheral vision, and by the third day of her visit, she had arrived at a conclusion that displeased her considerably. That evening she contrived to be alone with Patience in the sitting room after dinner, while Lady Cecily was persuaded to play the pianoforte in the drawing-room for the Duke's theoretical entertainment. The Countess sat with her teacup and her pleasant expression, and said, in the manner of a woman delivering a considered kindness that is not entirely kindness, and said, "You must know that your situation here cannot last, Miss Hallowell." Patience looked at her. "The Duke will remarry. He must. A man of his position, a house of this size, an estate with no settled heir. He cannot remain indefinitely in this half-state. When that happens, the companion of the previous Duchess will naturally have no place in the new household." She paused. "I say this not unkindly. I have known women in similar positions who waited too long and found themselves without references that were still current. It would be better for you to make other arrangements now, while you may do so at your leisure." Patience looked at her with complete composure. "Thank you for your counsel, my lady," she said. "You have been here some years." 3, yes. "That is loyalty. Loyalty to a dead woman cannot sustain a living one indefinitely." Patience said nothing. The Countess appeared to take this as agreement, which was its own information about the Countess. She spent the remainder of the evening being extremely productive in the library, which was where she went when she had feelings that she preferred not to sit with directly. The following morning brought an unseasonable warmth and a series of small events that Patience registered at the time as ordinary and understood only later as a sequence. She had risen early, as was her habit, and by mid-morning had taken her basket to the kitchen garden to gather late herbs for Mrs. Aldwych, the housekeeper. The kitchen garden was walled on 3 sides and caught the October sun well. Patience had her bonnet untied and was moving between the remaining thyme and rosemary with the quiet pleasure of someone who finds physical occupation clarifying. She became aware of the Duke's presence when he was already close, which was unusual. She was generally better at registering the approach of other people in spaces. She turned. He had come from the direction of the study, through the side gate, and he was alone, which during the Countess's visit had been uncommon. He had the purposeful walk of a man who has made a decision and is now acting on it. She was apparently the estate matter today. "Miss Hallowell," he said, "walk with me." She set down the basket. She walked. They went the length of the kitchen garden in silence and turned at the far end, toward the low stone wall that looked over the ha-ha and the meadow beyond. She was accustomed to silences of various kinds and had learned, over years of close proximity to people in difficult states, to read the species of a silence by its texture. This one was not comfortable, and was not hostile, and was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who was choosing his words with particular care, which was distinct from his usual silence, which was the silence of a man for whom words had simply been reduced to their most functional quantity. At the low stone wall, he stopped and looked out at the meadow, which was golden with the last of the autumn grass. She stood beside him at a proper distance. "My wife left instructions," he said. She waited. "In the letter." He paused. She could see, from the corner of her vision, that he was not looking at the meadow, but at some middle distance that was not quite anything. She left instructions that you were to be given a permanent position in the household, to be defined at my discretion. She gave her reasons. Another pause. They were characteristic of her. Patience felt something careful and precise shift in her chest, something that she had been holding in a particular position for a long time, without realizing she had been holding it. She kept her face composed. She said you were the most honest woman she had ever known, he said, and that she did not trust the house to go on well without you. He still did not look at her. She also said that I was prone to severity, and that a corrective was not entirely unwelcome. Patience said after a moment, "She was right, on all counts." He looked at her then. "I know she was." A pause settled between them that was not the same species as the previous silences. It was a pause that had something in it. Something that had been accumulating without her quite tracking the accumulation. "Why did you not tell me the letter existed?" he said. "I did not know what it contained. I only knew that it was addressed to you, and that you would read it when you were ready." That is what she said to me, the day she gave me the key. "You have been here 3 years. Yes. You did not press the matter. It was not my matter to press." He studied her with the gray water eyes, and she held his gaze without flinching. Because she had nothing to hide, and she did not intend to begin constructing evasions now. And there was a point, she had learned, at which composure became its own form of courage. The holding of one's ground when the ground was honest ground. "The Countess," he said, "has suggested that Lady Cecily would be an appropriate match." Patience said nothing. "I wished you to know," he said, "that I do not find her suggestion compelling." She had, for a moment, nothing to say at all, which was unusual for her. "That is your own business, Your Grace," she said finally. "Yes," he said, "it is." He looked at her for a moment longer, then reached down and picked up her basket from where she had set it on the path and held it out to her. She took it. Their hands did not touch. She was aware, with a precision that had nothing rational in it, of how close they did not touch. The exact quantity of air between his fingers and hers, which was a thing she had no business being aware of, and was aware of nevertheless. "Edwina wrote that the letter was to be given to me when I was ready to open the vault," he said. He was looking at the basket, rather than at her face. "I had believed for 3 years that the vault contained her death, her absence, preserved. I had been wrong about that." She understood that he was not speaking only of the vault. "What did it contain?" she asked, because she was honest, and she was curious. And she had learned over the years that asking what she needed to know was more productive than waiting for it to be offered. "Evidence," he said, "of a person who had attended my wife in her final illness with a devotion that I had not been present to offer, and had asked nothing in return for it." He finally looked at her. She was very specific. She kept detailed accounts. Patience felt the prick of tears, which was inconvenient, and managed them with the efficiency of long practice. She was always thorough. She was. He was quiet for a moment. She was also, it appears, conducting a rather deliberate plan. "She was that too," Patience said. The ghost of something moved in her voice that was not quite grief and not quite warmth, and was most accurately described as the particular tenderness one feels for someone who was right about things in ways that only become visible after they are gone. This time what crossed his face was unambiguous. It was not quite a smile, but it was its immediate antecedent, a brief softening around the corners of his mouth that transformed his face in a way she had not seen before, and that made her breath catch before she had any intention of catching it. He did not pursue the moment. He was a man who understood the value of restraint, of not pressing past what was appropriate, of letting a thing be what it was, rather than hurrying it into something it was not yet ready to become. He said, "The Countess intends to stay another week. I intend to be particularly engaged with the estate during that period." He paused. The kitchen garden was very quiet. "I would not be opposed to assistance with the library inventory." "The library is in considerable disorder," she said. I had noticed. "It may take some time to complete." I had anticipated that. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the kitchen garden held its breath along with both of them. She was not a woman who allowed herself to hope easily. Hope was expensive, and she had learned over the years to manage her expenditures carefully, to invest only in what the evidence supported. The evidence available to her in the kitchen garden was limited, but specific. A man who did not find the Countess's solution compelling. A man who had been thinking about the vault's contents for some time without acting. A man who had told her these things when he had not been required to tell her anything. She was also, as Edwina had apparently documented in that vault, honest above most other things, and honesty required her to acknowledge what her body had already decided, which was that she wished to be in the library with him for as long as the library could reasonably be said to require her presence. "I will be there after breakfast," she said. He nodded and turned back toward the house, and she watched him go, and then stood in the kitchen garden for a moment longer, with her basket of late herbs and the ribbon of the key now absent from her collarbone, replaced by the smaller and stranger weight of a morning she had not anticipated when she rose. If you have ever waited a long time for a thing you had stopped permitting yourself to want, you will understand what the next fortnight was. If you have ever sat across a library table from someone who makes the air feel different, not dramatically, not with trumpets, but in the particular way that a room changes when someone whose presence matters to you enters it, you will understand the quality of those mornings at Ashwell Park. They worked. That was what it was, and she would not have characterized it as anything else. She catalogued and he reviewed, and they spoke, carefully at first and then less carefully, of the books themselves, of Edwina's system for organizing them, of the history of the house, of the particular Wiltshire autumn visible through the library's tall windows, of a poem she had found tucked between the pages of a volume of sermons that neither of them could attribute, and that made him read it twice in silence, and then set it very precisely on the table, without comment. He had a mind she had not been given the opportunity to observe in operation before. She had known him as a presence, as a social fact, as the particular gravity of a house arranged around a man's grief. She had not known him as someone capable of considered humor about agricultural tracts, or of the kind of attention to a small detail in an illustration that suggests a person has looked at things carefully for a long time. She found this, unexpectedly, a difficulty. It was easier to maintain appropriate distances from a man one knew only as a fact than from a man one was beginning to know as a person. The Countess watched from doorways. She was too intelligent to press her advantages directly, which told Patience that she had correctly assessed the Duke as a man who would not respond well to being managed. What she did instead was arrange small scenes, Lady Cecily at the pianoforte in the evenings, with her golden hair and her modest gowns. Lady Cecily at the breakfast table with a particular propriety of arrangement. Lady Cecily mentioning the Fernmore estate at regular intervals with the trained casualness of a young woman who has been carefully coached in how to remind a man of his own interests. The Duke attended to these performances with the expression of a man sitting through a concert of music that does not suit him, patient and present, and privately elsewhere. Then he watched Patience return the sheet music to its proper place on the rack without being asked, and he watched her do it with the exactness of someone who finds the correct ordering of things its own satisfaction. And Patience, who was not looking at him, could feel that he was watching, which was its own considerable inconvenience. On the 12th day of the library inventory, she was reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, a heavy brown octavo on the second from top, that required her to stand on the lowest rung of the library steps, and he came to stand beside her to take it down, because it was high, and she was not tall enough to reach it with confidence, and his hand came past her shoulder very close to her face. He did not move back immediately. He was close enough that she could hear him breathe, and she could sense the warmth of him, which was a thing she was attending to rather more closely than was sensible. "Patience," he said, her given name in his voice. She had not heard it before. He had always said Miss Hallowell, always the formal address that was correct and appropriate, and which she had told herself she preferred for excellent rational reasons. She had not expected to discover that the absence of her name in his voice had been a kind of suspended breath, and that the arrival of it would feel the way it felt. She turned. He was very close. His face, which she had learned to read in the particular way one learns to read a face that conceals most of what it knows, was not concealing anything at this moment. The gray-water eyes were direct, and what was in them was not uncertainty, and was not the careful performance of a man in a position he had not chosen. It was something considered and specific and present. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what constitutes an appropriate length of time." "Appropriate length of time for what?" she asked, because she was, above all, honest. "For a man in my position to acknowledge that a woman in your position has been essential to this household in ways that have very little to do with the library," he said, "and to ask whether she would consider making her position permanent in a rather different sense." She looked at him steadily. "You are being indirect," she said, "for a man who generally is not." "I am being careful," he said. "They are not the same thing." "What are you being careful of?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Of frightening you," he said. "You are not a woman who accepts things she has not freely chosen. I would not have you feel that circumstance or obligation had anything to do with whatever you decide." He paused. Edwina was very clear on that point, also. She put it in the letter. She put a great deal in the letter. Was there anything she left out? "She left out," he said very quietly, "the fact that I would not be ready to read it until I had already arrived at most of its conclusions on my own." The afternoon light came through the tall library windows and lay in long rectangles on the floor, and the room smelled of paper and leather and the particular dust of books that have been read often enough to carry it. The house was quiet. Somewhere in a distant room she could hear the pianoforte, which meant Lady Cecily was performing to an audience of furniture, because the only person in the house who might have been her audience was standing in the library on the 12th rung of this conversation. Patience thought of 3 years of small, invisible acts, of the ribbon at her collarbone and the weight of the key, of a woman who had been careful and competent and had expected nothing, and had given everything she had to give, and had believed that this was simply what her life was, not what it required of her, because requirements imply alternatives, and she had not always been certain she had alternatives. She thought of what it meant to be asked. "I would consider it," she said, "if asked properly." He understood what she was saying. She saw it in the slight shift of his weight, the very small change in the angle of his shoulders, a man collecting himself for something that deserved his full attention. "Miss Hallowell," he said, and his voice had the particular gravity of a man for whom gravity was not performance, but nature. Would you do me the honor of agreeing to be my wife? It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as a proposition offered by a man who had understood correctly. That she did not respond well to elaborate approaches, to preamble and qualification, and the performance of uncertainty when the essential thing was already known. Yes, she said. The word sat in the library air between them with a completeness that surprised her, as though it had been waiting in the room for considerably longer than either of them had been in it, sitting in the space behind the books that no one had catalogued yet, patient and certain. He reached for her hand. She gave it. He held it with a care that was its own declaration, his fingers folding over hers with a deliberateness that told her he had thought about this, had considered what it meant to take her hand, not as a social form, but as a beginning. And she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and into her chest, displacing something that had been sitting there in the cold for a long time. Her heartbeat was audible to her in a way it normally was not. She did not attempt to regulate it. She simply stood on the library steps and held his hand, and felt the particular quality of a world rearranging itself. He did not kiss her then. She had not expected him to. He was a man who understood that some things are earned by patience, which was, she thought, an appropriate irony, and she permitted herself to acknowledge it privately. "The Countess," she said. "Will be informed tomorrow," he said, "that the matter she came to settle has been settled to the satisfaction of the party, whose satisfaction was the only relevant consideration. Lady Cecily will be disappointed." "Lady Cecily," he said, "is 20 years old, and will find a man better suited to her temperament before the next season is out." "You speak with confidence." "I have been told I do that." His thumb moved across her knuckles, a slow, deliberate thing, and she felt it across her entire arm and then further. "My wife found it useful, on occasion. She mentioned it to me. I suspected she might." He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in the direction it had moved in the kitchen garden. "She mentioned a great many things to you that she did not mention to anyone else. She trusted me with things she trusted no one else to hold," Patience said. The truth of it was steady in her, the way honest things are steady. "I am glad she did." "As am I," he said, and he meant the key and the letter and the 3 years and all of it. The library settled around them. She did not remove her hand. He did not release it. They stood in the long afternoon light among the ordered shelves and the smell of old paper and the ghost of Edwina's pressed violets. And Patience, who had not expected to be chosen, allowed herself to feel the full weight of being chosen, which was considerable and warm and had been a long time coming. The Countess departed 2 days later, with Lady Cecily in tow and her carriage horses in some difficulty with the newly frosted lane. She said her goodbyes to the Duke in the hall with a graciousness that could only have been produced by considerable effort. She said her goodbyes to Patience with the careful smile of a woman who has been outmaneuvered and is choosing, deliberately, to conduct herself well about it. "I see I misread the situation," she said to Patience when they were briefly alone in the vestibule, the Countess drawing on her gloves with the precision of a woman who performs even departures with intention. "You read what was visible," Patience said, which was charitable and also true. "He is not an easy man," the Countess said. "No," Patience agreed. "He is not. You are, I suppose, accustomed to him." "I am learning him," she said. "There is a difference." The Countess studied her with those sharp eyes, and in them Patience could see something adjust, some category being revised, which was a thing the Countess did not do easily, and which Patience, for that reason, found she respected. "She chose well," the Countess said at last, and it was not quite clear whether she meant Edwina choosing Patience, or the Duke choosing Patience, or Patience choosing him. And it did not matter, because all three things were true. And in the morning, the announcement would go to the papers, and it would cease to be a private truth and become a public one. The carriage departed and took the frost mist with it, and the great door of Ashwell Park closed, and the house exhaled. That evening, Patience sat in the library after dinner with the announcement notice that Mr. Crane would take to the papers in the morning. She had written it out in good copy, because her hand was steadier than the Duke's with formal documents. The fire was lit, and the library lamps cast their warm light across the shelves, and the evening had the quality of a thing completing itself. The Duke sat across the table from her with the estate ledgers, because he was a man who did not change his habits simply because circumstances had changed, and she found this suited her very well. She had not wanted a man who would become a different person. She had wanted this one, specifically, with his gray eyes and his careful silences, and the way he had held her hand as though it were a beginning. Because it was. At some point in the evening, she became aware that he had stopped looking at the ledgers. She could feel it before she looked up, the change in the quality of the room's attention. She looked up. He was looking at her with the gray water eyes and the particular attention that she had first noticed in the east corridor, and there was nothing withheld in it now. It was simply what it was. "What is it?" she asked. "I was thinking," he said, that she was right. He did not specify what Edwina had been right about. He did not need to. Patience knew well enough, because Edwina had said most of it to her in person, in the slow, careful conversations of those final months, saying that the house needed someone who would not be afraid of him, that he had always responded better to honesty than to management, and that the whole difficulty was simply that neither of them would see it without some assistance. Patience looked down at the announcement notice, and then back at him. "She usually was," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, and what she felt in that moment was not triumph and not vindication, but something quieter and more durable. The sense of a thing correctly named after a long time of going unnamed. A thing that had always been there, patient as the vault, waiting to be unlocked by the right person asking for the right thing at the right time. She picked up her pen and made the final correction on the notice that she had been holding unfinished in her hand. The fire was warm at her back. Through the tall library windows, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, very lightly, on the grounds of Ashwell Park. The kitchen garden was already white at its edges. The key hung on its hook beside the steward's door. Quiet and unrequired. The ribbon not worn at the collarbone anymore, but resting as things rest when they have finished their work. The vault was open. It would not be sealed again.